Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamerTed.com video, we're going to be discussing HUMA. That would be HUMA, and it stands for Heterogeneous Uniform Memory Access. Now, this is quite a complicated subject. It's most likely going to go into 2 videos, and it's most likely going to be an article as well. Now, the original statement is that it's a part of the PlayStation 4, but not part of the Xbox One, and this was from AMD's Senior Product Marketing Manager, Mark Diana. I'm going to give you guys a spelling for that. That is M-A-R-C-D-I-A-N-A for Diana. Now, there is a little bit of confusion on this. Now, we're going to discuss what HUMA is in just a moment, although a lot of new details on HUMA are going to be released for AMD in November accordingly. But this is the important part. There has been information that this has been inaccurate. Basically, during a recent interview in Game, this is press release from AMD. During a recent interview at Gamescom 2013, to an AMD spokesperson made inaccurate statements regarding the details of a semi-custom architecture APU, which is outside of quote from him. That's the all-in-one chip that's found inside the PlayStation 4. And then they said that AMD will not comment on Xbox One or the PlayStation 4 and memory architectures, and will not speak for Microsoft, Sony, or any other AMD customers. End quote. So, take of that what you will. So basically, we're going to be discussing what HUMA is and how it may impact the PlayStation 4. I would like to point out that this means that AMD have said it's inaccurate. There are 2 ways you can look at this. One, he wasn't supposed to actually say this stuff. In other words, oops, my bad. In other words, NDA broken. The second option is that, well, he's wrong, or it's completely inaccurate, or this not quite like that, and therefore, well, this stuff is an error. So, I will be covering it quite in depth, however, regardless. There will be more stuff on this coming up, and there will be a hell of a lot more details on this in November. But for now, I'm going to go with what we do know, okay? So, as I said, there will be an article in the next couple of days on this, which will go into more details, and if necessary, I'll split this into 2 videos. I'm not really sure how long this is going to take me to explain. So anyway, it's been very requested, so let's jump right in. So before we really start to delve into the depths of HUMA, we're going to actually do a little bit of a detour. Now, back in early 2000s, we're talking about 2002, 2003 era, there was a GPU graphics system known as the Radeon 9700. And that would put out about 30 G-flops of computing power. Now, to give you guys a point of comparison, about 10 years later, and by no means is this the most powerful card on the market, we've got the Radeon HD 7970. That's capable of about 4.3 G-flops. I'll say again, G-flops. I'm sorry, T-flops. So that's an absolute ridiculous increase in performance. You've gone from 31 G-flops of performance to 43 T-flops of computing performance. And this is not the case with CPUs. If you were to look at, say, the early 2000s, 2003, 2002 CPUs like the Pentium 4s, and compare that to like the high-end CPUs of today, it's quite a disparity. I mean, for example, the Pentium 4s put out about 12 G-flops. A really high-end i7 now puts out about 336 G-flops. So you're looking at about 300 G-flops compared to 43 T-flops. That's not even a comparison. That's the equivalent of getting absolutely destroyed. What does that mean? Well, it means a couple of things. Firstly, a modern-day CPU is, well, about 10 times slower than a GPU in certain tasks, and this is the important part, because a CPU, as you guys are aware now, cannot do everything that a GPU can do as effectively, but a GPU cannot process all data like a CPU can, simply because it's a general purpose CPU rather than a dedicated device like a GPU. And so AMD basically released this to build upon HSA, and it's known as Intelligent Computing Architecture. Now I'm going to read you guys out a direct quote from AMD's marketing spiel. Enable CPU, GPU, and other processors to work in harmony on a single piece of silicon by seamlessly moving the right tasks to the best suited processing element. End quote. So in other words, it moves data from the parts that it moves data from one part to a different part depending on what is best suited at to process. And so you can use the following as points. Coherent memory. This ensures that the CPU and GPU caches both see an up-to-date view of the set of the data. So in other words, they're not lagging behind one or the other. Pageable memory, that allows the GPU to seamlessly access a virtual memory address that's not yet present in physical memory. An entire memory space. This means that both the CPU and the GPU can access and allocate any location of the system's virtual memory space. Okay, I know what you're thinking. So, what about the Xbox 360? Because I have pointed out that has unified memory. So what gives? What the balls is the difference between unified memory and HUMA, right? I mean, they both have the same memory pool, right? I mean, they're both sharing the same RAM and so on. So what's the difference? What's the separator? Well, the best way to think of this is that memory is separate. So think of it this way. The memory of a typical unified system like the Xbox 360 works on a single memory pool. This is true. And then this memory is split accordingly. So, just for example, a pure example, let's say that they want to make it so that it's 512 megabytes by the way of memory. We're going to ignore the fact that a certain portion of this is allocated to system resources. So in other words, we're just going to assume that all 512 megabytes of memory, just for the sake of ease of use and ease of explanation, is available to games developers. It's not, I just want to clarify that, it's not all available, but we're just going to assume for the purposes of this, to make maths easy for us, for the love of God, we're going to assume that it is. So we're also going to make some really simple mathematics here, nothing too complicated. Let's assume that you are a games developer, and let's assume that you are developing a title for the Xbox 360. That means that you must make some decisions. In other words, you must decide how much graphical assets are, you must decide on how much data code is going to cost, how much data, for example, for audio, how much data for this, how much data for physics, all of this stuff. So all the way down to, say, a light fixture, all the way to the guns, to the scary monsters that are chasing you, all of this requires memory. Nothing particularly new, exciting, or difficult to comprehend there. Now there's two differences. One, we know that a typical system, for example the PC, you've got two memory pools. One, the general memory pool, like the main system RAM. The second would be GPU memory. Now for a PC it's not too bad, because GPUs on a PC have ridiculous amounts of memory. We're talking, 1 gig, 2 gigs, 3 gigs of RAM. And then, of course, you've got system allocated, general system RAM, which could be like 8 gigs, 16 gigs, whatever. For an Xbox 360, and we're just going to be using this as an example, we're going to pick on it for a moment, things are a bit different. You've got a very limited, finite resource, and the PlayStation 3, for example, had 256, so in other words, it was two separate sets of memory on the console. Now, as a developer, this means that you can allocate 256 megabytes to graphics and 256 to general purpose stuff. Now, once again, this is not exactly accurate because, once again, there is a certain amount of memory allocated to system functions. And by the way, system functions are operating system functionality drivers, UI, whatever else that you see. For example, when you're applying to someone message on PSN or Xbox Live, that's actually loaded into main system memory, and one of the reasons that not all the memory is available to games developers. I hope that makes sense. Anyway. So, unified memory says this isn't the case. There's not this arbitrary split of whatever percentage is. Games developers are free to utilize the memory in whatever blocks that they choose to. So in other words, if they said, well, all we need is 40 megabytes of graphics memory, because that game's really simple, but it takes tons and tons of memory doing physics or audio or whatever the hell they want to do, this weird abstract weird ass game that we're creating in our minds right now, is trying to explain this really weird allocation of memory. You can see that they have the freedom to do so. You could think of this if anyone has a partition on a hard drive, and this is a really, really good way to look at it. A partition on a hard drive, just in case you're unaware, you could actually have one physical drive, and you could split that drive into multiple drives. So, for example, you could split it into, say, two parts. Let's say you have a 1 terabyte drive. You could split that into like 512 gigabytes and 512 gigabytes. Not quite that, because of the way drive space works, but let's just pretend for the purposes of this to make it simple. Or you could split it in a different way. You could split it like 200 gigs, 800 gigs. So, for example, 200 gigabytes for operating system, 800 gigs for whatever the hell you want to install. Or you could split it 3 ways. You could have like 200 gigs, and then the remainder, or whatever. You could have like 50 drives if you really wanted to. I'm, of course, taking the piss now, not being, too serious, but you could basically split the drives however you want. But it's the same physical hard drive, but you're basically creating these memory partitions. And it's a little bit different here, but you guys get the idea of how it works. So the PlayStation 4 is not quite like that, or apparently HUMA is not like that. I'm going to be more accurate, because the PlayStation 4 has not been confirmed to be like this. The PS4, on the other hand, there isn't really a distinction anymore. The lines, if you will, are blurred between the CPU and the GPU partition. This means that, in theory, either the CPU or GPU can utilize the same piece of data at the same damn time. So it doesn't need to copy the memory. So you lose the time from copying from A to B. This is very similar, for example, if you've got 2 hard drives. You'll be very familiar with it. If you've ever copied, like, have you ever done a cut command on the same drive, like Control X or right click cut? And then you paste it to a same folder in the same drive. You notice how fast that is, because it's basically just saying, well, I'm not going to go into the details, but it's quick on the same drive. On the other hand, if you're trying to move it to a different partition, notice how the drive whirs, because it's actually moving it from one partition to another partition. This is very similar here. So to clarify, this is pretty huge, because what it basically means that the GPU and CPU are on the same chip. We know this, of course, the AMD Jaguar in the case of the PlayStation 4. And it does have a few other bits and bobs in there, including, for example, various IOs or input-output, audio, for example, and a memory controller. We know this. The GPU and the CPU in the case of the PlayStation 4 have a couple of memory buses. They have a memory bus which can talk to one another. So the GPU can say, "Hi there, CPU, what are you doing?" "Well, I'm actually doing this, thank you, CPU. I'll get around to that other data you wanted me to process in just a moment." "Okay, then, top of the day to you," says the CPU. In other words, they have that bus, and they also have a couple of other buses. They have the bus to talk to the memory independently, so they have the onion and the garlic, or the one allows the GPU to speak to the memory directly and bypasses level 2 cache. We'll go into that in a moment. And then you've got the CPU side of things, and the CPU side of things, the CPU can directly talk to the memory as well, and that has a portion of the bandwidth available. In other words, the CPU actually has a fraction of the available bandwidth. We think I know I've said this a couple of times, I might as well go through it just in case you're a new viewer or you've forgotten or whatever. It has about 20 gigabytes per second of bandwidth out of the 176 gigabytes per second bandwidth, and the PlayStation 4 is using 5500 megahertz RAM on a 256-bit bus. So that's how we get those figures. So what does this actually mean? Well, basically it means that you're no longer having these two separate memory blocks. You're no longer having this block where the CPU is really jealous and says, no, you're not reading from that, you're not doing anything from that, that's mine. You understand me? You're gonna go to that room now, GPU. So in other words, the data doesn't have to keep being copied backwards and forwards, which means that, well, it means several things. It means that there's less APIs involved, and it's a lot easier for programmers. Programmers don't have to concern themselves quite as much, let me clarify that, with memory management. Obviously, this is not some magical fix where memory is suddenly this unimportant thing where memory bandwidth and everything else don't matter. Now, the other benefit between this is that it allows coherency. So there doesn't have to be multiple copies of the same file. In other words, you don't have to have, for example, texture A, whatever that texture A is, whether it's some dude's face or his boot or a gun or a wall or a building or whatever. It doesn't have to be multiple textures or multiple parts. And obviously texture is a shitty example, but physics are a pretty good example. It's also a lot more efficient for the APUs and the SoCs of AMD. So, in other words, you get better performance out of it, you get a better mileage out of it. Just as an FYI, this is very similar to how multi-core CPUs can share the same, can actually share the same memory. Imagine this world where multi-core CPUs, they couldn't actually do that. They were forced to instead have their own memory blocks. So let's say you had 8 gigs of RAM, one processor would have to deal with one block of RAM, another processor would have to deal with another, and it wouldn't really be that smart, would it? So for example, let's say you've got a core processor, you can kind of see how that's going on though. It also lowers the battery or power usage as well, and actually improves the performance from the same form factor. More to the point, it actually reduces development costs because it's actually more efficient for people to program in a similar architecture. It requires less people, and also it supports multiple mainstream programming languages. This includes Python, Java, and most importantly for the PlayStation 4, C++. Now I will be going into this stuff in a different video, primarily on the libraries and PlayStation 4, because I've been doing quite a lot of research actually on programming, as it turns out C++, and I'm actually creating my own application for you guys. I think I've mentioned it a couple of times on Facebook, which allows you, as it turns out, to calculate the performance of GPUs and, as it turns out, memory. So I'm going to be releasing that for completely free on the channel in the next, I don't know, week or so, depending on when you watch this, it might already be available. I'll just need to fix a couple of little bugs and add a few features in. In short, you can think of it like the GPU and CPU are going to work much better in harmony. The CPU can much better tell the GPU what it needs help with, and the GPU can much more efficiently process that data. In fact, in tasks which are highly parallelized, in other words, they are better split up in doing multiple things, GPUs, as we've discussed, can be like 10 times more efficient, faster, a lot faster. But traditionally, the GPU finds it very difficult to reach that potential. And so what you get is, a lot of the time, you get, obviously, games and OpenGL stuff. So, for example, 3D Studio Max, or maybe an application like, say, rendering on Adobe Premiere, or whatever, or the latest game, whether it be, you know, the new Doom or whatever. Obviously, fine, the GPU is really good for that, and we've actually started to discuss the evolution of GPUs and how now parallelized parallel computing now is becoming such a part of them, and this is because of the multiple little processors inside that. We've really gone into this in depth on the PlayStation 4 GPU videos, by the way, Xbox One versus PS4 GPU videos. Recommend you check them out, if only for the video on, what was it now? The GCN architecture. That's it. I did go heavily into that, so you guys can check those out if you want. They're on a playlist on the channel's front page, and I would recommend you check those out if you want more details on that. I'm sorry. And the HSA will actually be able to handle all of this itself. And so the purpose behind this is that the GPU and the CPU can much more efficiently communicate and work on tasks together. This also means that AMD actually had to do other bits and pieces, for example, like update the GPU instruction set to be able to much more efficiently communicate and speak to the system's memory. So you can think of it, rather than this massive division between labor, between the CPU merely telling the GPU what to do, they're working together in much better harmony. In fact, one way to look at this, and it's not the most elegant of explanations you could possibly have, but the CPU is actually really good at decision making. It is. It's basically like the Einstein. It's kind of like the architect. It can tell the GPU what to do very well. The problem is it's not that fast at doing it. It's not that strong. It's not Hercules. So it's almost like the architect is telling like this really, really big burly man to, how to build his wall. And the big burly man in this case is the GPU, and it doesn't really know how to do much other than kind of hammer a few bricks together. The GPU, on the other hand, is very fast, is very powerful, is very strong. It can do its commands very well simply because of the SIMD, that is SIMD architecture. We have gone into that. There's single instruction multi-data. In case you're not really familiar with that is, I'm going to very briefly explain it. I have gone into this a lot more in the GCN video. Once again, I recommend you check it out if you've not already done so. But all SIMD most basically means is single instruction multi-data. That basically means that one instruction set is given, one instruction is done, and then all the little processors do their work until that instruction is finished. And this is actually works very well with compute as well, especially with the various changes that AMD have made with the Q structure, 64 rather than, I believe it's 2, that's for memory, of the traditional 7970, for example, architecture, in other words, the 7000 series range. So in other words, now you've got a processing system which are much closer to being, brothers, rather than being, distant cousins on their mother's side or something like that. It's no longer to the point where one gives one task and then that task is done really quickly and then it has to wait, has to copy the memory over. It's not like that. It's a lot more seamless. They can now work together in tandem. It's a lot more efficient. And you've got to bear in mind that the PlayStation 4 is a great candidate for this architecture. Why? Because it's not that fast. I know people are already going to be raging, but it's true. I mean, look at the GPU inside the PlayStation 4 and compare that to, the one we mentioned earlier. 4 T-flops compared to like 1.84 of the PS4. You see where I'm going with this? In other words, a much more efficient architecture is what's necessary. It's not just a case of, we can throw in loads of cores. Yeah, you could do that, but it starts ramping up the cost. There's a difference between efficiency of movement and power, right? And therefore, in this case, it's much more efficient to actually utilize the resources they've got to be able to do a lot more cool stuff. On a PC, it's not like that. On a PC, you've got so much more memory, so much more GPU performance anyway, that it's not so much of a big deal. It will eventually become to the point, no doubt, where HSA or APU type of architecture is going to become a standard even for a PC. I mean, one example of this actually from AMD is they believe what's going to happen is you're going to have an APU type of processor. Think of Jaguar Mark II, because we know that CPU inside the Jaguar, we know that they've got 8 CPUs, each handles 1 thread each, and we believe it's 1.6 gigahertz. But the performance of that CPU, even compared to like a high-end AMD or Intel processor of today, it's very low. It's a low-power CPU, and that's why its efficiency. Now, there are a couple of points, as I was saying. The next generation APUs that we're going to most likely be seeing in PCs, at least according to AMD. Now, this is the key point. According to AMD slash NVIDIA, things are going to be very different. NVIDIA have one direction they want to go in. AMD have another direction. Intel, of course, have their own direction. For example, with the cancelled Larrabee chipset, which I'll go into in a different video. I'm not going to bother to belabor the point too much. But in other words, each manufacturer has their own idea. But with the case of APUs, AMD have this vision of, look, you're going to keep your dedicated graphics card. That's not going anywhere for gamers because it's not cost efficient to put in like £500 or £400 or whatever worth of GPU onto the CPU. No one is going to be able to buy that because let's say you can't afford it. Let's say that games development, for example, one of the things that you have to upgrade a lot faster, as it turns out, is your GPU. CPU wise, you're probably going to be okay for a couple of generations. GPU, maybe. So they have this vision of, okay, you're going to keep the APU, and the APU will be able to process certain tasks, for example, physics or whatever, on the onboard APU, but then you're going to have this discrete graphics card, which is going to plug in with like PCIe 3 or 4 or whatever it turns out to be at that particular moment. Who the balls knows? And Bob's your uncle. In other words, the dedicated device will be processing the graphics, the APU will process, for example, physics or AI or whatever. But obviously a lot of this stuff is really transitional. I don't think anyone could have predicted what the market would have been like 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, because things move really, really fast, and sometimes it's very difficult to comprehend, if you will, how things are going to go. Similarly, there are a couple of other points I'd like to make. Firstly, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, it's very early. I mean, AMD are very, very keen to say, Sony would be very keen, although they have not released this information, so just how accurate it is in terms of HUMA, because obviously there is a leak from it. Well, I suppose the leak, I mean, as I said at the beginning of the video, AMD then released another statement and said, well, it was kind of a mistake, that's not really true. But it's hard to know. Maybe they're just under NDA and it was like, oh crap, shouldn't have said that, sorry. Ignore self-destruct message. It's very difficult in this world because obviously there's so many NDAs. This is another point as well. Who the hell is going to be really truthful? Like, for example, John Carmack was very careful with his wording on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. He said, yeah, they're pretty similar. Their architecture is very similar. Yeah, okay, but which one's better, John? And he said, well, I haven't really done enough testing. And I don't blame him, because he can't say, well, this console sucks, actually, in my personal opinion, because it's not very good message. I mean, could you imagine, for example, if he said, yeah, the PlayStation 4 blows and the Xbox One is a lot better, or reverse, it doesn't matter which one, this isn't playing favourites. For the purposes of this video, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, he'd get so many comments. The rage would be like... I mean, there was a rage on the game rage on the PC port, but I don't think that would be anywhere near the rage you'd get just on that alone. And of course, it's very difficult because then developers start to burn bridges, or publishers, so it's very difficult to know what their real thoughts are on this stuff. But suffice to say, one issue I will say is I'm going to be very curious to see what the tool chains are going to be like, and just how simple it is for developers to really start to utilize these features. This has been something I've actually said all along about the two unique features with both consoles. The PlayStation 4, of course, being compute. The Xbox One does have compute, but it sucks compared to the Xbox One. I'm sorry, the Xbox One's compute sucks compared to the PlayStation 4, so let's actually get that out with some vague degree of accuracy. And the PlayStation 4, of course, does not have cloud computing. Mark Cerny says, well, we could add that if we wanted to, but I don't believe in it. Hard to know how accurate he's being there. Obviously, the PlayStation 4 was not designed ground up for cloud, so it's difficult. But Mark says, well, it could have been, and we could add it, but we don't believe in it. And so here's the problem with that. How much for games that are developed with cross-platform in mind. In other words, Xbox One and PlayStation 4. Ignore PC just for a moment. Just pretend it doesn't exist for just a second, even though you should, because obviously there is some still issues there in regards to compute and so on. But as I said, PC compute is really powerful anyway, so who cares? So let's really focus on the two platforms that we're talking about in this video. Xbox One and PlayStation 4. The question is, how able are people going to be to really push those when they're developing cross-platform in mind? And so whenever we're talking about any of these features and functions, it's very important that they're very, very easy to implement. If they're not, it's very risky for developers to do so, because if it takes them, a team of 5, for example, the best part of 6 months to implement those features, that team's not doing anything else. They're basically spending money to just to utilize a set of features that only, just for example, 50% of the users are going to utilize. And so it depends on just how well it is. And this is another issue actually I've had with the Xbox One in regards to the ESRAM inside of it. I am somewhat curious in 3 years' time at just how developers are going to find that ESRAM, and if it's going to be a hindrance. Microsoft say no, but of course they're going to say no, and that's the kind of the key word there. Although the the Xbox One does have those move engines, and from what we do understand, they're actually very efficient at doing what they do, moving around data. I know it's a surprise, so I guess it's kind of like anyone's ball game. So yeah, for HUMA, there's going to be a lot more stuff released on it over the next couple of months, no doubt, and we're hopefully going to get right down to it. I wish Mark Cerny would clarify this, I really do. I have a feeling he won't. He probably will in the future, who the heck knows. And obviously AMD still have these NDAs which are going to be in place for goodness knows how long. Obviously I don't have the contract in front of me, so I can't say, oh okay, this expires on the 12th of March 2015 or whatever. I don't have that data in front of me. So yeah, but hopefully it's given you an idea of what HUMA is. I will be doing an article in the next couple of days which is going to go into the workflow and stuff like that, so give you guys even further impressions of it. This is one of the most requested videos out there, so hopefully it's answered some questions. And I'm going to go and have a mental breakdown after I've explained all that. Now, not really, I'm going to relax, and I'm probably going to watch a TV show. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now. Before I forget, if you're still unclear about anything, please write in the next day or two on facebook.com/redgamingtech. Message me. There's a couple of us working on the channel. You could message Paul, who would be me, /Crimson Rain, whatever. And let me know any issues you've got with it, and I'll try to amend the video or the next video or the article or whatever accordingly, or I'll try to directly answer you if there's been something you're still unclear on, and I'll try to make some clarification. Anyway, with all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.